At the Toronto Zoo, there is a wooden walkway that goes up beside the enclosure with the tigers. And always when you go to the zoo, there are lots of people on that walkway, leaning over, taking pictures of the tigers. Sometimes they're not supposed to, but sometimes they make noises to try and get the tigers to pay some interest. And the tigers seem to pay no interest in the people at all. We went there with our little children, 3 little boys, and one of them wanted to get a better view. And so I picked him up and stood him on the post on the fence. Don't be disturbed. This was a long way back from the tigers. They were behind glass and wire and everything else. So I was holding him on the post, but even though there were those intervening wires and fences and so on, that got the tiger's attention. This tiger got up and went into hunting mode right away. He was ready. I guess he figured I was going to toss in a little tidbit for him to eat. I don't know. But that tiger was clearly interested. Well, we all get interested in things which are different, out of the ordinary. When something changes, we're interested. And we always want to know why. We want to figure out what's going on there. You've probably been amazed from time to time when you see an illusionist doing their magic tricks, right? I saw one once bring a coin right through a glass table. I have no idea how he did that, but someone else was holding the coin under the table, and somehow he pulled it out of her hand right through the glass. I have no idea how that happens, but there you are. I'm sure there's just a logical explanation for it. But we always want to know. When we see something strange and unusual, we want to find the answer. And I'm sure that's at least a part of what was happening with the Magi when they saw the star in the east. It told them, according to their interpretation of the heavens, that a king had been born in Bethlehem of Judea. How they figured that out, I have no idea, but that's what they figured. So they had to come. They had to see. They had to make that journey to find out what was new, what was different, what had transpired there. And because they knew that this person was special, they brought those special gifts. This was the beginning of how the light of Christ went into all the world. Now we heard this morning a reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 60. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. And it talks about the light going into all the nations. And kings of Tarshish will come, kings of Sheba will come. They will come from afar because there was something new and wonderful and amazing in the land of Israel. Well, part of what's new and part of what is amazing is the shift in understanding about how God deals with humanity. You remember reading in the oldest parts of the Bible, we read about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of individuals. There was the God of all of Israel. And when the people of Israel were in Egypt and were laboring as slaves there, seeking deliverance, they called upon their God, who was, by the way, stronger than the gods of the Egyptians. That's how they saw it. Their God delivering them from the God of the Egyptians, taking them out and bringing them to a new land. And in fact, one of the arguments that Moses used to God so that God would not turn away from God's people, that God would continue to lead them because they'd sinned and Moses was afraid God was going to give up on them altogether. And the argument that Moses made to God was, what are all the other nations going to think if you gave up on your people? I mean, think about it, God. If everybody else sees that you weren't able to deliver your people, I mean, this is going to look pretty bad for you, God. Now, if you read it in the Bible, it's a little more stilted language, but that's basically the message. Moses is trying to persuade God, you don't want to be kind of like the laughing stock of everybody as a God who couldn't deliver. So, get us out. And so God continued on the way. But that shows you that Moses' understanding of God was very local, very narrow. That God was there for the people of Israel, and everybody else was an enemy. And so everybody else could not call upon the name of the God unless they became one of the people of Israel by conversion. In our reading today from Ephesians, we hear Paul talking about the mystery hidden for the ages. And what is that mystery that was hidden for the ages? The mystery is that God is God of the whole earth. Now, the ancient Israelites talked about God being the God of the whole earth, meaning, I think, that God was the preeminent one, the most powerful one amongst all the gods. And when you read through the Psalms, you often find, who among the gods could say, who is greater than the God, our God? So they understood that there was many gods, but only one really good one, theirs, which is what everybody else said. The only really good God was our God, the one that they had. So the mystery of the revelation that was made known in Jesus was that the light of the world was going to everyone. And you might remember that the Apostle Paul had a real struggle with the other apostles. There were the 11, well, there were 12, and then Judas came to a very bad end. And there were 11 left, and then they brought another one in named Matthias. And by the way, that's the last you ever heard of Matthias after he was made an apostle. So there it is. So Paul was called by Jesus himself on the road to Damascus. You might remember that story. We'll do that again on January the 25th. That's when we'll celebrate that day of the conversion of Paul. And he saw himself in a different light from everybody else, and saw himself as the least of all the apostles because he came late to the game. He wasn't there as a follower of Jesus, as the others were during Jesus' ministry. He was converted after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, after the day of Pentecost, sometime after Paul was converted. But Paul saw this as an opportunity to bring him into an understanding of the truth of the gospel that perhaps the other disciples hadn't yet grasped. And that is that the gospel is for everybody. That this God is the God of everybody. Now, Peter talked about it on the day of Pentecost when he stood up and preached to all the people that were there, because there were people coming from all over the world into Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. And as they came, remember that passage from the Arabians and Cretans and residents of Mesopotamia, Cappadocia, Pontus, Phrygia, that lovely passage that we always read on the Feast of Pentecost. They came from all those areas, but they were all Jewish. They all came with a faith in God, and it was to them that Peter and the other disciples preached, and it was those folks who were converted. Paul understood that the gospel goes also to the Gentiles, to everybody else. And in that, there is something for us about understanding the true way to bring gospel to all the world. Let's just divert for a moment and think about the opposite side of that. I've never served in the armed forces, but I understand that part of the training, at least in some countries, in preparation for hand-to-hand combat, the soldiers are trained to think of the enemy as not human. It's very hard to kill someone you love. So you've got to think of the other person as not even human. And then it's possible to carry out that kind of warfare. What Jesus was doing was helping people to understand that everybody is human. We're all one nation. We're all one group. We're not little groups with different gods, little groups with different ways of understanding things. We're all one people. And that was what God intended to do. That's the story of Pentecost. Remember on Pentecost, the gift of tongues? That undid what was done centuries before. Remember when they built the Tower of Babel? This is the Old Testament stuff. They built the Tower of Babel to reach up to the heavens so the floods wouldn't get them anymore. And God was concerned, at least that's the way the writer interpreted it, God was concerned that they would actually get up to heaven, so God confused their languages, and they all spoke different tongues. So the story of the gift of Pentecost is an undoing of what happened before. Once before, we were all different and distant from one another. And on the day of Pentecost, when everybody could understand the languages spoken by the apostles, all was brought back together again. And what God seeks to do to us is help us to understand that everyone, in every nation, every type of person on this earth, and maybe even beyond this earth, are all one under God. Not just all under one God, but all one under God. And God calls us to live in such a way that others are called to that same grace. In one parish we were in, a family were interested in joining the church, and we had them over to our place for a Bible study. And our kids were running around and so on. And afterwards, that family said that they decided to join our church because they saw within us an example of the love of Christ. They experienced the love that we shared, and that brought them to conversion. And I think it's just like standing on a pole and drawing attention to yourself when we as Christians show ourselves to live our lives differently than anybody else does. More kindness, more grace, more love, more patience, more understanding, more compassion, more gentleness than they see anywhere else. They want to know how it's done. How is it that you can be so gracious to someone who's so unkind? How is it that you can be so filled with hope in the midst of suffering? How is it that you can return goodness continually no matter what is given to you? And when people understand that the answer to that question, how is it? It is because of the grace of Christ in our hearts. That's the best method of letting the light of Christ shine into all the world. Jesus came as a baby in Bethlehem, and the stars brought the Magi from the east. Now Jesus comes to the world in our hearts, and it is our light that shines into all the world to bring others into that same place of grace. That's God's gift to the world. It is us. The message of redemption comes through us, not just for us, but through us. This is the mystery that was hidden throughout all the ages and made known in these last days. And by God's grace, we are the ones who carry that word of salvation to everyone.